Thank you for coming to our talk on mutual aid. I'm one of the two people representing One Island Family, the southernmost UU congregation in the continental United States, based in Key West, Florida. Our building is on the traditional territory of the Calusa and Tequesta nations. I'm music director and Zoom aficionado of that congregation. Mutual aid is a concept that underlies a lot of what we as UU congregations do already. Help and support each other in times of trouble and crisis. The fact that we're doing this from the grassroots level rather than through overseeing organizations that are more distant from the actual recipients of the aid is an important distinction. My presentation will enumerate some of the ways in which mutual aid is part of our lives. Key West is a tiny island off the southern coast of Florida. Here's the map of Florida. What trails off here, you see the Florida Keys at the bottom, are 43 islands connected by bridges over 125 miles up to the mainland. The island of Key West itself, the last island, is only 2 miles wide by 4 miles long, with about 28,000 year-round residents. That number swells to about 40,000 people on any given day during tourist season. It's a busy little island, and it is a close-knit community. A very artistic, irreverent, creative, and iconoclastic group of people are attracted to this place. In fact, in 1982, after the US Border Patrol set up a roadblock to check cars for drugs and illegal immigrants, the Conch Republic was formed. Key West nominally seceded from the unions. Here's the Conch Republic flag. The motto is, "We seceded where others failed." Here are some good-natured Conch Republic protesters. An indication of the Key West determination and spirit of inclusivity is the city's motto, "One human family." Created by one of our congregants, this began as a local proclamation and has expanded beyond our boundaries. It's a call to include LGBTQ people, immigrants, differently abled, people of color, all are in one human family. Tomorrow is annual National HIV Testing Day. I thought I should mention that during the height of the AIDS epidemic in 1986, a group known as AIDS Help formed in Key West. Their purpose was to supply medical guidance, food, companionship, and housing options to people living with HIV. That made a big difference to a number of people in our community. A memorial has been placed on one of our piers to commemorate those in our community who have died of AIDS. Because of its location, Key West is susceptible to natural disasters, particularly hurricanes, which can cut off electricity, cable and phone service, deliveries by truck, and even water through a pipeline from the mainland. We are absolutely dependent upon the single 2-lane highway that runs from Key West to the mainland of Florida. This road brings us food, building supplies, paper goods, in other words, all of our essentials. And the highest point on the island is only 16 feet above sea level. Here's a view of our Fort Zachary Taylor State Park. Following this are some photos of Hurricane Wilma in 2005. It is true that people who choose to live on Key West know what they're getting into. It is hit by hurricanes fairly often, and hurricane season can be a nerve-wracking experience. There are a few days as a hurricane forms when the state government can issue an emergency evacuation order. Then the problem is where to go. The entire state of Florida can be in the track of a hurricane. As happened to one friend of mine, she evacuated from Key West where the electricity and water were cut off for a week, only to end up in Sarasota where there were no services for 2 weeks. So what do people do here? They help each other. Supplies are gathered to begin with. Calls go around to see if anyone needs anything. If people need help boarding up their windows or bringing in deck furniture, that is provided. People touch base with each other. If someone's alone, they might be invited to stay with a friend or a member of one island family during the storm. We also look out for each other's pets, and that can be a tricky consideration. During Hurricane Irma in 2017, one of our arts organizations in a very sturdy building opened its doors to people who were in particularly vulnerable areas. They also had hardwired phone service, so messages were being passed on constantly. Hurricane Irma hit the Middle Keys harder than the city of Key West. So our members and others were driving back and forth with food supplies, building supplies, tarps to cover damaged roofs, and more. Although this is not hers, one friend of mine whose trailer home was completely destroyed had 2 busloads of church groups magically show up and pitch in to clear her land and remove the debris. Makeshift relief centers sprung up, like this one at mile marker 50. That's how we designate addresses along Route 1. And there was still need for help around the holidays, so a toy drive was initiated as well. Ways that One Island family is specifically involved in community action and mutual aid is through our highway cleanup program. At least twice a year, our members don their safety vests and head out with garbage bags to clean up the environment. And Habitat for Humanity needs volunteers to help restore, build, and renovate structures. At least 2 of our members are beneficiaries of Habitat for Humanity housing. On a personal note, I do spend my summers on Peaks Island, Maine, a community of only 1,000 year-round residents. A situation where mutual aid has gone to the internet is exemplified by a recent disaster on our island. 2 islanders lost their home to a devastating fire. Not only were offers of supplies, food, and clothing and help made, but a GoFundMe campaign raised over $90,000 for the couple on this little island. On a larger scale, a bridging organization known as Grassroots International works for social justice goals around the world by going into communities and finding out what the basic needs of the people are. Then they offer assistance with as little red tape and restrictions as possible to those communities. We at One Island Family aim to keep the 7 UU principles in our minds, our hearts, and actions throughout our days and our lives. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to my friend, Astoria.
Thank you, Nancy. Bear with me as I share my screen. Just one moment. There we go. I'm Astoria Nickerson, Director of Children's Religious Education at One Island Family. We are a community of helpers where mutual aid is a lifestyle. The island of Key West is about 4 miles long and 1 mile wide, and I am proud to call it home. We are small, but mighty. Henry Ford II once said, "No society of nations, no people within a nation, no family can benefit through mutual aid unless goodwill exceeds ill will, unless the spirit of cooperation surpasses antagonism, unless we all see and act as though the other man's welfare determines our own welfare." Our members give their time and talents to many local organizations who serve the community. Some are cooking with love. They prepare and deliver hundreds of hot meals to the elderly. The Key West Tropical Forest and Botanical Gardens, keeper of the trees, because we wouldn't survive without them. Keys to Be the Change and Take Stock in Children provide scholarships and mentoring to our youth, our future. Nancy Forrester's Secret Garden and Bird Sanctuary and the Key West Wildlife Center care for our feathered friends that need to be rehabbed and/or rehomed. Protecting animals means that we are preserving our precious ecosystem. The Community Foundation of the Florida Keys provides grants that ultimately serve those in need. The Key West Sunrise Rotary is part of Rotary International, the largest service organization in the United States. The Key West Sunrise Rotary do their own fundraisers throughout the year to raise money that they give to support local nonprofit organizations and high school scholarships to worthy individuals or teams in need of assistance. In times of emergencies like hurricanes, Rotary clubs around the country contribute supplies and equipment. After Hurricane Irma, the club coordinated delivery and distribution of tons of water, tools, and clothing for first responders and others. During the hurricane, it was mandatory for all first responders to stay in Monroe County. However, they were duly tasked with needing to care for their families and everyone else. Key West Sailing Center is committed to sailing education, recreation, and social use. On an island like ours, they ensure that the sport of sailing is accessible to all. Florida Keys Outreach Coalition for the Homeless provide valuable housing to those displaced, but especially women and children. SOS, Star of the Sea Foundation, is the largest food bank in Monroe County. They ramped up services during the pandemic and distributed meals, which were available in several areas, making food available to those who needed it. Sister Season Fund helps locals with rent and utilities when they become temporarily unemployed. This is vital in Key West, as our primary industry is tourism. I just mentioned 11 organizations that serve the Key West community and are served by a church with 30 members. Our church. This is a picture of one island family. We are small, but mighty. When the pandemic began, we used technology in new ways to keep our connections strong. Under the tutelage of our talented music director, we were able to continue Sunday services. Members who were in other parts of the country were able to join. And even during those trying times, we stayed connected. There was a bright side. We learned and we grew. We remained flexible and open to new possibilities. Author Heather Marsh has said, and I'm paraphrasing, "The first thing that happens in a disaster is the breakdown of hierarchy and the establishment of altruistic aid." Members ran errands for each other and did things like grocery shopping for those who weren't able. The church cleared its pantry and donated the food. Emails went out with offers of food. We checked on each other and developed an emergency list of phone numbers and addresses so that everyone had a lifeline. Members practiced social distancing and sheltered in place. As time went on, we stayed safe and we showed up for each other. There was gardening and leisurely walks, protecting each other's mental health with movement and light socialization. We were our brother's keeper. Once a vaccine became available, tech-savvy members lined up appointments for those who weren't able to do it for themselves. They also ensured that everyone had transportation to get the vaccine. The congregation intuitively made things happen. We are small but mighty. Fort Zachary Taylor is a 54-acre historic state park centered on a Civil War-era fort near the southern tip of Key West, Florida. When it was safe and COVID restrictions eased, members felt comfortable getting together. We would sit near the spot where the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico meet. These were informal gatherings. We laughed, fellowshipped, and watched the beautiful sunset. This is a picture taken at one of our Saturday sunsets. The sight is nothing short of spectacular, and the company was just as good. During Hurricane Irma, the first hurdle was evacuation. FloridaCounties.com notes that the Hurricane Irma evacuation was the largest mass exodus in U.S. history, with 7 million people across Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina being asked to evacuate their homes. 54 counties issued evacuation orders. Those who evacuated worried about being able to get fuel, as many gas stations ran out of fuel 1 to 2 days before Irma hit. A drive from Key West to Orlando, which would normally take about 7 hours, was now over 13 hours long. The path of the hurricane was at times uncertain. People evacuated to areas that came under hurricane watch and then needed to find another safe place. There came a point in Key West where all reservations for car rentals were canceled. I know this because my reservation was canceled. Then all flights stopped. A friend at church asked if I wanted to evacuate with her, but not wanting to be a burden with 2 children ages 8 and 11, I declined. I stayed. A member of one island family gave me a safe, well-stocked place to stay, her home, because at that time I no longer had a home. She made sure that I had groceries, water, batteries, flashlights, money in case the ATMs weren't working. All these things were hard to come by as residents and visitors swarmed grocery stores to stock up on essential supplies. We were all concerned, and everyone at One Island family kept in close contact. We were our brother's keeper. There were the last few hugs, then the worry was almost overwhelming. We are on a small island connected by bridges, one way in and one way out. I called my oldest son and reminded him of the contact information for my life insurance policy. There was a calm before the storm, then the storm. Phone service was lost. The National Weather Service notes that on the morning of September 10, 2017, and I quote, Irma strengthened to a Category 4 hurricane as it accelerated towards the Florida Keys. The eye made landfall in Cudjoe Key at 130 miles per hour, end of quote. My daughter recalls the walls rattling, and it sounded like there was a train outside. We made it. I couldn't communicate that we were safe for a few days. It was possible to make a phone call at the only hospital in town if you were able to get through the downed trees and debris, and if your car hadn't been impacted by flooding. Those who evacuated weren't sure what happened to their family, their friends, or their home. There was devastation, but we were lucky to be alive. The day after the storm was eerily calm. There were no flocks of birds. We saw military helicopters in the sky and knew that help was on the way. A few days later, power was restored, and there were the first phone calls filled with happiness, tears, and gratitude. Members gave of themselves and checked on everyone. The people of the church provided for each other. A church of 30 serves not only each other, but at least 11 community organizations on a regular basis. Those organizations serve the community, which includes churchgoers. What a beautiful cycle. Through hurricanes and the pandemic, At One Island Family, mutual aid is a lifestyle. We are small, but mighty. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Reverend Barbara F. Myers. I'm the board president of the UU Mental Health Network, and I am here with another member of our board, Sonia Mudrick, to talk about what the UU Mental Health Network is doing and how you can get involved. First, we'll give an introduction, and then we'll share the vision that we have for the network. I'll talk about some focus areas that we have, and then we'll talk about how you can get involved. The UU Mental Health Network is about 3 years old. We have a board of 7 people, 4 of whom are officers that you can see there, and then 3 at-large members of the board. And Sonia is one of the at-large members of the board.
So our vision is that we want people with mental health problems to feel included, safe, respected, and beloved. We want for congregations and their ministers to talk about mental health and mental health problems. We strive to demarginalize and destigmatize mental health conditions, and part of it is to talk about it more often and more freely. We want to educate people with and without mental health issues what it is like to live with and around mental health problems. We want to share resources regarding treatment options and lifestyle changes that are conducive to improving mental health. We want to provide information on what is available and what may be coming. One of our goals is to further evaluate within the UUA what people need and want in terms of support, help, representation, and inclusion. We want to provide online discussion platforms for people living with mental health problems and their families, starting within congregations, but possibly also doing it region-wide. We want to focus not only on problems of living with mental health issues, but we also want to have a place to share success stories and illustrate that you can live a meaningful and fulfilled life despite mental health problems. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Sonia. We have 4 focus areas where we have decided to put our efforts. They are education, worship, support groups, and social justice. So I'll talk about each of these areas. In terms of education, there's a book called Held, Showing Up for Each Other's Mental Health, that I wrote. It was published by Skinner House Books, UU publisher, in 2020. And it has chapter questions after each chapter so that it can be used in book reads, and it has been used by a number of congregations as a book read. A number of the quotes in there are now in the UU Worship Web, and also quotes from other books having to do with mental health are in the Worship Web now, that so they can be used in services throughout the denomination. And we've held workshops focused on the content of the book in various different congregations around the country, even some that are non-UU. What we want to do is to have more books, more educational materials. There's one proposal that is being worked on right now for a mental health justice book. There's a book on emotional CPR, which I am one of the editors of, that's about ready to be published. Emotional CPR is a program from the National Empowerment Center in the Boston area, and it's focused on showing people how to be with someone who's in a mental health crisis and be helpful to them. And of course, we want to see other kinds of books as well. In terms of education for congregations, we want to first find out what the congregations need and then perhaps provide things such as webinars or a venue for sharing stories or more things that might be helpful to congregations in their education about mental health. And we want to provide resources for congregations beyond what we ourselves have done. In terms of worship, we've done, I personally have done, and I know other people on our board and our former board members have done worship services in congregations focused on mental health. Many UU ministers have written a sermon about mental health, and there is a library of those sermons that we have. What we want to do is we want to have a speakers bureau with people who can speak when there's a request for a speaker on mental health issue. We want to have guides for giving worship in a congregation that focus on a subject of mental health, and we want to have periodic online services that we ourselves put on and focusing on mental health themes. In terms of support groups, we see ourselves focusing on marginalized populations, LGBTQ populations, BIPOC populations, or other populations, having an online group where they can share what they go through in terms of mental health problems. We want to enhance our advice on how to run a local support group. So if you have a support group you want to run, we want to give you advice about how to do that. We want to support emotional CPR trainings to help people in crisis, and we want referral resources for congregations. We're just beginning to do social justice work. There's a picture of me there with Jacqueline Duhart at a demonstration in our local area where we were protesting the death of prisoners with mental health issues in their jail. And 40 to 50% of the prisoners have mental health issues. In addition, we have begun a dialogue with the Side with Love to see if there's any synergy between what they're doing in terms of decarceration and what the kinds of work that we'd like to get involved in. We want to do more things, of course, more work on decarceration, a way to protest the harmful use of solitary confinement, which causes mental health problems. Many times people with mental health issues are put in solitary confinement, and that makes things worse for them. We will be doing some joint work with a Facebook group called Mental Health Justice UU, and that's just the preliminary understandings without it are just being worked out right now. And of course, we want to do more things. So we have a board of 7 people. We can't possibly, by just 7 people, do all those things by ourselves. We need committed and people that are motivated to do this kind of work to help us. So you can do this by joining the UU Mental Health Network at uumentalhealth.org/join. There's a dialogue where you can tell us what you're interested in. You can help us determine what our priorities are. And you can, if you find one of these teams that we're working on, you can join a team and help make all of this happen. Thank you for being with us. And I'm Barbara Myers and Sonia Mudrick. And
thank you.
Our email is info@uumentalhealth.org and our website is uumentalhealth.org. So thank you very much.
Barbara, if you have anything to say, I will try to get the other video up while you're saying it. There was a gap last time. I thought it might help. Let's see.
Okay. Well, I'm really happy to have been invited to be part of this webinar, and I saw some of the comments that went by in the chat about that jails are the de facto mental health institutions in this country right now, especially for people who can't afford them. And that is something that our Unitarian forebear, Dorothea Dix, in the 1830s and 40s, when she was going around finding out where people with mental health problems were being kept, she was horrified to find that they were being kept in jails and sometimes in people's basements in chains. And she led an effort to get hospitals built. And over time, those hospitals were not adequately funded and turned into what they call snake pits, that you might have heard about, which is horrifying conditions. And then our country decided in the 1960s and 70s that it was going to get rid of those kinds of public mental health institutions. And what do we have? People are now back in jails. So we've come full circle. And Dorothea Dix would be just horrified to find out what has happened in this country. And I am motivated to try to do something about it, and I hope some of you are too, and we'll be getting involved in some of our efforts. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I'm ready to share screens. I think I can find it. Let's see, it's right here. And
with Love organizing strategy team at the UUA. I was really looking forward to being with you tonight to talk about mutual aid, but unfortunately, life had other plans. So I hope you enjoyed these recorded remarks. And if you have any questions or comments, please email me. I'll share my emails on the screen here. Before I get started on the presentation, I want to give you a quick overview of Side with Love. Side with Love focuses on the UUA's 4 intersectional justice priorities of LGBTQIA+ and gender justice, decriminalization, democracy and electoral justice, and climate justice. I hold the UUA's climate justice work, which includes managing the Create Climate Justice campaign and the Green Sanctuary program. The Climate Advocacy Lab recently shared an excellent email about mutual aid, and I really appreciated the framing. They organized it that mutual aid is solidarity, not charity, a natural human response to disaster, immediate single responses to an event, or long-term and supportive communities, building long-term supportive communities. And also mutual aid is an act of resistance. I'm going to walk you through a few UU examples of mutual aid for climate justice that I've seen since I've been in this position. This year has seen one climate disaster after another, from devastating wildfires in New Mexico and California, to flooding in Kentucky and Pakistan, to the drinking water crisis in Mississippi, to Hurricane Fiona and Hurricane Ian. We have barely been able to catch our breath from one disaster to the next. And I know many of us are grieving and recovering for these and so many other disasters we've experienced this past several years. I've taken heart, however, at the resurgence of mutual aid since the pandemic. As we've seen this past couple of years with so many historic events, one thing is true: when our systems fail us, our community doesn't. Dismantling racism and other forms of systemic oppression is absolutely central to creating climate justice and critical to creating thriving communities. In the United States, communities impacted by racist housing policies like redlining experience disproportionate climate impacts, including more extreme heat, more intense pollution, higher poverty, and significant health disparities. For example, Black children are twice as likely to be hospitalized and 4 times as likely to die from asthma as white children. BIPOC communities experience the harshest impacts of climate change and climate disasters, climate-related health impacts, and daily exposure to the pollution that drives climate change. The new Green Sanctuary 2030 program focuses on congregational transformation, justice, and mobilization. Green Sanctuary teams are required to cultivate trusted relationships with frontline communities to work in direct, collaborative relationships. This intentional focus helps UUs move from paternalism and charity to solidarity and community. Earlier this year, several UU organizations, including UUJEC, came together to release a UU statement of commitment in response to climate force displacement. Black, Indigenous, people of color, frontline, and other oppressed and marginalized communities who've done the least to contribute to the climate crisis historically are facing the worst of its effects. Many of these communities have been displaced from their homes, and millions more will follow in the decades ahead. This involuntary climate exile is both a global and domestic human rights problem on a massive scale. Not only does it deprive millions of people of their rightful homes, it also forces them to seek resettlement in a global community that's really done little to ensure safe and dignified reception of people seeking asylum, especially migrants of color. Whoops, excuse me. Following the lead of frontline communities to advocate for immigration rights is an example of working in solidarity, not charity. This element of mutual aid is vital to building resilience. So, for example, the North Shore UU congregation in Danvers, Massachusetts has worked with the Essex County Community Organization on immigration rights, economic justice, and ending mass incarceration. They joined ECHO in a solidarity pilgrimage for immigrant justice, and members joined the 6-day march, offered meals and accommodations to the marchers, and generally were out in force. UUs joined ECHO to have Danvers, Massachusetts proclaimed a safe city or a sanctuary city. For predominantly white congregations, leveraging our privilege and social relationships can build power to change dominant political systems and infrastructures that we need to advance climate justice and build community resilience. Redlined communities or sacrifice zones also bear the highest energy burdens in the country, with low-income communities spending 3 times more of their income on energy costs. I'm sure these percentages on the screen are much higher now than when this study was done, because costs have skyrocketed this past year. Urban heat islands plus high energy burdens plus poor air quality, all of these things combine to increase incidents of violence and mental health crises in redlined communities, which leads to increased incarceration and criminalization of people of color. Again, it's impossible to separate struggles for climate justice from racial justice because they are so deeply intertwined, both here in the US and across the globe. Several green sanctuary teams are working on energy justice and utility justice issues. For example, the UU Fellowship of Athens, Georgia is working with the West Broad Advisory to identify opportunities to weatherize low-income homes in their community to offset their carbon footprint. The folks in the congregation who are knowledgeable about energy efficiency, weatherization, and energy improvements are offering their knowledge and resources to help reduce the energy burden of low-income households in their community, which reduces the overall community footprint, while also building the kind of trusted relationships we need to build climate resilience. This is an example of mutual aid as a means of building long-term and supportive communities. As I said at the beginning, climate disasters are claiming hundreds of lives, destroying homes, and causing really unimaginable damage to communities. People of color are more likely to experience climate force displacement and least able to recover, often by design, as FEMA and other government programs too often prioritize white communities in disaster response. The list of the ways BIPOC communities are most impacted by climate change and most unfairly treated goes on and on. As congregations working for climate justice, we have a responsibility to be fully aware of the power and resources we have, and to redistribute and leverage our power and resources to support the leadership of self-determination of frontline communities. We must know what we have to offer and make our resources and our people available as generously as possible. In this sense, mutual aid is a natural human response to disaster. An example of this is the Greater Nashville UU congregation in Tennessee, in a joint effort with the First UU Church of Nashville. They worked together to receive funding to support Black-led community partner organizations engaged in relief efforts following a tornado. The congregation quickly applied for the UUA disaster relief funds and were able to quickly designate the funds received to communities of color. As Reverend Cynthia Kane explained in our first disaster response workshop, I believe we would not have had the ability to do this had our members and leaders not already been involved in local efforts and organizations. Relationships are critical to mutual aid and to creating climate justice. I hope you've seen all of these examples, in all of these examples, that mutual aid is an act of resilience and an act of community. I want to invite you to the latest in our series of workshops on climate resilience through disaster response and community care. It'll be, the final one is on November 15th, and it's a community conversation on the issues. We've also created Climate Disaster Preparedness for UUs, which is a resource for organizations. I'm sharing all the links that I'm mentioning in this presentation as a document, so hopefully somebody can put those in the chat for me as this is going. Additionally, I'd like to invite you to join our monthly Green Sanctuary team meetings on the third Wednesday of the month at 8 Eastern. In November, the UU Congregation of Columbia will describe step-by-step how their congregation created a climate change team in 2018, going from concept to over 100 participants on 10 action teams in just 1 year. They'll share positive and negative lessons learned, including how they got their members to volunteer, act, and lead. So we invite you to come together for shared learning and mutual support with other UUs working on congregational transformation through climate justice on the third Wednesdays of the month at 8 Eastern. So hope to see you in November. And finally, should have showed that on the last slide. This is the upcoming Green Sanctuary meeting on November 16th. The previous ones listed there, we have recorded. So if you're interested in any of those, you can reach out and I'll send you the link to those. Finally, in case you forgot, there's an important election in November. I want to ask you to do one simple thing. Talk to your friends about voting. Even better, make a commitment to talk to 10 of your friends, neighbors, colleagues, people who care about climate change. Talk to them about voting. You can also sign the Climate Justice Voter Pledge, which will be in the chat as well. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about mutual aid and climate justice. Please reach out if you want to talk about these things with me, or if you want to let me know what your congregation is doing. My email is rmisslevy@uua.org, or if you can't remember that, you can always send it to environment@uua.org. Thank you so much.
I'm just impressed by all these presentations. And very grateful. And I think that what happens in these presentations is we begin to see what mutual aid actually looks like in practice. So it's not just a theory or something for big discussions for theologians or academics or scientists. You can actually start to see what mutual aid would be. I want to emphasize this is a religious discussion, that we are talking about really not just social transformation, but spiritual growth, coming into an understanding of what organized religion is really all about, as expressed in many, many different traditions. It's just, first of all, the awe that we have in the midst of nature, and it can be a terrible beauty, as Yeats would say. I think Key West understands that it's a beautiful environment much of the time, but in the midst of a hurricane or a threatened flood, and this is something Astoria talked about in the video, it can be pretty scary. When you think about what was actually being said in that Key West video, and Marilyn, maybe you can correct me, I think the highest point is about 16 feet on Key West, above sea level. That's pretty scary when you think about it. And you come to terms with nature and you begin to think about what does it mean to try to live in this natural world that we have abused in so many ways. To get beyond that, and I think all the great religious traditions have talked about this need for mutual aid, just to look out for each other. And again, I come back to Key West, is the understanding that our neighbors are not just people. They also include all kinds of wildlife. So we're concerned about what happens in gardens and refuges for birds and animals. And that when we ask about who is my neighbor, we're beginning to realize it's more than just people. So there is a spiritual transformation here. With technology, what happened because of the COVID pandemic, and it happened, I think, to everybody on this conversation, we had to discover this new technology, all this computer stuff and Zooms and webinars. And we had to become computer literate very, very fast. And and I know that happened on Key West, but it happened in hundreds and hundreds of congregations everywhere. And this is a change in the way we practice our religion, whatever our religion might be. And I can only compare it to what happened when the printing press was invented. Suddenly everybody had to become literate and everybody could get books. And that changed religious practice. And I think something is similar is happening because of computers. We all have to get on board, and it's starting to happen. So it's a time of transformation. Some congregations are capable of rising to the challenge, and some have done splendid work. And frankly, others have really just gotten washed away. I heard about one church, not a UU church, that used to have 400 people on a Sunday. Now they get maybe 50. And you really have to, and this has happened in other places. Some congregations can rise to the challenge and others are just going to fade out of the picture. I saw it happen in New Orleans after Katrina. Some congregations, conservatives and liberals, really became community centers, and others really just closed their doors, and that was it. So we'll see what happens, but it is a time of not just economic and environmental change, but religion itself is changing, and all of you are part of that. Thank you.